And so that's really where what I'm going to be talking tonight comes from. Well, the end goal is building whole startups so that we can build a regenerative economy. And to get there, we need to understand why startups fail and how can we remove the underlying causes of failure so that we're not wasting huge amounts of resources in simply keeping ourselves and the startups alive, resources, wealth that could go into creating a regenerative economy that is really regenerating everything we touch. So that's what that's what I'll be talking about. What we're up to in Evolute 6 is everything you have up there. Educating entrepreneurs in how this works, creating startups and startup ecosystems, and we're working hard to get to the point where we can invest in those ecosystems as well. Almost everything I'm going to be talking about, you can read more about in the book that I published just over a year ago, which is available online to order wherever you want to. And it's also, Marie has quite a few copies in her home. Were we physically present today, we would have a box of books in the room to give out. Marie has that box at home, so feel free to message Marie for details on those books physically available in Berlin. So, moving on. Actually, let me go small first. Right. So, some of you have already hopefully filled in the first multiple choice poll. I will do that. So, of the people that are in here, 56% of us want to found a startup. 11% are growing a startup. Another 11% interested in transforming an existing business. 22% want to leave their corporate career for startups. Nobody seems to be a full-time mum or dad wanting to add a startup. Nobody is nearing retirement yet. And nobody is an investor wanting their money to do more. 33% want work to fully reflect who they are, where they can spend every day doing what brings them to life. And 89% want to make a difference to our climate, to resources, social, etc. challenges. So this is a superb blend of people to be participating in this. I think that everybody in here is going to get something out of this talk. We'll have space at the end to dive into more questions, but the areas we're going to really focus in on is, the first 3 points. How ought you to start up a startup now? What should you take into account for it to be really successful so that you remove the primary failure modes? If you're growing or transforming an existing business, again, what are the failure causes that might trip you up? If you want to spend every day doing what brings you to life, well, this way of structuring a startup where you've removed most of the failure modes are naturally healthy places for people to work in. And everything that I'm about, everything that we're about in Evolute 6 is how can we use the power of business to really make a difference to climate, resource, social, etc. challenges. So, this is an image of a typical portfolio of 100 startups, where by the end of this graph, most of the startups have already gone bankrupt. The middle startup has also gone bankrupt. And there are just a couple of startups that are still alive at the end, the unicorns, and the entire average returns are dominated by what those unicorns are delivering. And the question I have is, why do startup portfolios look like this? And even worse, why do we accept it? Why aren't we throwing everything away that leads to this, and instead making sure that when we create startups, they behave like this? This is what I'll come back to at the end of this talk. What really makes this graph the way it is and this graph the way it is. But to get there, I will show you, first of all, a few of the root causes. And before I do any talking, we move into the next poll. What are your thoughts about the root causes for why startups fail? Many of the standard root causes that we see why companies fail. So what can we do about it? Well, at the heart of what we're seeing there, management team conflict is a big one. And often the way that management team conflict is resolved is for whoever is the highest paid person, their opinion dominates over everybody else's. And this is where management team conflict gets to be a huge problem. That gets exacerbated by unpredictable events in the outside world. Every single startup failure at some point involves some unpredictable event. And there's also 100% mismatch between how investors interact with each other, how the roles and the people interact with each other, and person-to-person interaction through the whole organization. These are the primary drivers behind only 1 in 12 startups really delivering capital growth, behind us simply not having been able to get impact investing, ESG, triple bottom line to really work. Were all of this a natural part of how businesses worked, we wouldn't be dealing with a climate catastrophe, degraded nature, degraded soil, degraded water, etc. So when I started seeing this clearly 10 plus years ago, it became clear that if we could remove the fundamental causes of failure, we could make it natural to have companies that are highly impactful, where the triple bottom line works, and where we are regenerative towards all of these catastrophes. So we just need to stop accepting the status quo. Where can we learn what to do next? Well, the start point is simply to recognize that we can make the impossible normal if we recognize that it's the way we are looking at things that forces us into this compromise between either high impact and low returns, or high returns and poor impact. We can make the impossible normal and sit in that sweet spot. And the question that I started asking myself many years ago is, why is this not normal already? Because I firmly believe that it can be normal. Well, one of the answers is to, as I said, look at how we build. If you go back in history, for an example, the Ulm Münster was built towards the end of the 1800s, 1889 as I recall. And it was more or less the tallest stone structure in the world, and it's still the tallest stone church structure in the world at 162 meters. The tallest around was 170 meters. You couldn't get taller than that until somebody by the name of Gustav Eiffel built like that something twice the height of the Ulm Münster, the Eiffel Tower, by recognizing that if instead of building it with solid blocks of stone, You built it primarily with fresh air, separated by iron girders, connected together to each other. You could build something easily in excess of the tallest structure that had ever been built before. So this is one of the clues of what we need to do. We need to understand why things break and figure out a way of building that does not have that way of breaking in it. Nature is the perfect place to look. Nature has been building viable ecosystems for millennia, building them by looking at how can we put together all different kinds of components in a way where the system is whole and you have interactions between all the different components that enable the right flow of resources for life to thrive. So we can learn from nature how nature does that. And the reason why this is relevant, if we look at what our economy is a set of systems and interactions enabling a flow of resources so that human life thrives. If we look at what a company is, it's a set of systems and interactions at three types. At the investor level, the capitals and stakeholders coming in. In the organization design level, the roles, the tasks, and at the human being level, how the individual human beings interact with each other. Again, enabling a flow of resources so that the company thrives. And if you simply look at what is each of us again is a set of systems and interactions enabling a flow of resources so that each of us thrives. And with this I mean both the physical set of systems and interactions where physical resources flow within us, oxygen, energy, etc., as well as on the psychological side, my self-identity, my emotions, my moods, all of that is a set of different systems and inside me interacting with each other, enabling psychological resources, mental resources to flow so that I can thrive. So this is where nature comes in. An individual by name of Margaret Wheatley recognized a few decades ago that the way that nature heals itself is by increasing its connectivity. And as she said, to heal an ecosystem, connect it with more of itself. And this is really the key lesson for us to take away from here. For all of the ecosystems relevant from our global economy down to each of us as individuals in a startup or in a company, and all of the ecosystems between that, if we want to heal them, if we want to make them more effective, address the underlying causes of failure, the key thing to do is to recognize what are all of the components, all of the possible components, what are all of the ways that they could be connected to each other so that value can flow, so that resources can flow, and simply increase the connectivity. Connect more of the ecosystem with itself. So that then leads to the obvious question. If we want to make this whole for connection and interactivity, what really are all of the systems that ought to be in there and connected, and how should we connect them? What should we enable to flow? Because getting that to flow makes the entire ecosystem healthier, anti-fragile. And what are the causes of problems where we should try to decrease the flow? So that's what I'm now going to dive a bit deeper into. The starting point for what we're all about is what we're calling the adaptive organization. The adaptive organization has its roots in one of the most well demonstrated correlations between business results and a predictable measure, and that's interactivity. Over the past decade, there have been a number of studies across the world of companies trying to figure out what can we look at that will be a really powerful indicator of business results. And one of the things that has emerged with the strongest evidence behind it is simply interactivity. The more that the employees, the staff of the company are interacting with each other, the more likely it is for the company to interact, for the company to succeed, to deliver healthy business results. Now, if you think back to the earlier questions, any company where decisions are made according to the highest paid person's opinion, also known as management by hippo, if you have management by hippo, that is going to squash the interactivity. People are not going to share their opinions so easily with each other, and are certainly not going to share their opinions upwards in the hierarchy if the decisions are always going to be taken anyway by the highest paid person. So looking at this is one of the key takeaways. If you see anything in any of the elements that we've been pointing at over here, within yourself, within the company, anything where there is something that is suppressing interaction, suppressing connection, suppressing the flow of opinions and information, that's part of the root causes of failure. It's one of the key elements behind what we're seeing over here. Unresolved management team conflict leading to failure. And this is exactly what makes each of us as individuals, startups, and even mature businesses far more sensitive than we need to be to unpredicted change. That's what means, this is what leads to something unpredicted coming in, stressing the system beyond what it can absorb and leading to collapse. And the mismatches we have, in particular in our relationships with each other, and how we design the organization and fill the roles with people, again, those weaken the capacity of the entire system to react in an appropriate, fast and effective way when some unpredictable shock comes into the system. So, moving on then, how do we do it? The methodology that we've developed has 4 different legs. And I'll say a bit more about each leg in a moment, but the starting point is a combination in our 3-legged operating system of our adaptive way at the top, which addresses how to increase the interactivity within each of us and between us, having a fluid organization design, things like sociocracy, holacracy, etc., that increase the interactivity between roles and people, and the magic ingredient that is missing from many good attempts that have used either or both of those is incorporating in a way that includes all stakeholders and all capitals in governance of the company and in the share of the wealth generated by the company. So that operating system gives us a whole approach that is complete across all of the different kinds of interactivities within a company, gives us an ability to see where is there potential for a connection to be made that is not there, strengthen a connection that is there but is weak? And where are there components that are not actually included that ought to be included, because including them will give us more interactivity, more connectivity? The fourth component that we have to facilitate the interactivity within the company, but even more importantly, to facilitate interactivity between companies in more than just money, is a platform that we're busy building at the moment that will, based on blockchain, have a multiplicity of tokens to enable us to create flow of resources, of value between companies as well as within companies, without having to go via the euro or any other form of money. So that's at the heart of our approach, what we're working on. What we're doing, what we have started building a couple of years ago and are working on building through to completion, has at its heart a startup factory, which involves creating startups, accelerating startups, or transforming existing companies. Everything that comes out of that becomes a member of our startup ecosystem, all using this operating system, interacting with each other through the platform, enabling the kinds of interactivities and synergies and potential to address all of these root causes and replace them with an anti-fragile, vibrant living system, everything interacting, supporting each other just the way nature does. Of course, money is a core part of that, and we're starting up now the work on actually building an investment fund to back this, which will enable the whole thing to really do what nature does so well, which is all of the different elements of an ecosystem in nature collude with each other. They interact with each other in such a way that the ecosystem as a whole is in its best position to thrive. And that's really the big idea behind this approach, is to build in one go ecosystems of companies, where every single company in the ecosystem, every single person in the ecosystem has the maximum level of interactivity, which means that each of us as individuals can thrive at work. Each company has the best chance of thriving because we've removed most of the causes of failure of each individual company. And because of the ecosystem level connectivity between companies, we get the maximum possible out of it. So diving a bit deeper into that, the way that we're doing this, we can have individuals coming in, startups or mature businesses can come in, and investment coming in. And we have a number of entry points into our transition programs, supporting people who are changing career, into our Startup Creation Academy and Accelerator over here, and then on into the growth ecosystem. We work with partners and licensees. We're not doing this only by ourselves, and we actually want as many partners and licensees as possible to do it, because the more that this ecosystem is fed and the bigger it gets, the more anti-fragile it becomes, the more vibrant it becomes, and the more of the causes of failure get eliminated. Briefly, there are a number of entry points. The big ones are our foundation program and our transition programs. And I'll come back to this later if people want to know a bit more about that. There's also the entry point in March into the factory itself as the 2022 cohort. So, going into a bit of detail now. If we want to incorporate for connection and flow, we need to take all of these elements into account. Incorporating for connection and flow really means making sure that when you incorporate, you're taking into account nature, people, society, all individuals in the actual incorporated entity. The simple limited company or GmbH is too weak. It has too many causes of failure embedded in it to be viable to build a net positive regenerative economy. What that means is we need to incorporate in a way where all stakeholders are part of the governance of the company, which means that all capitals represented by those stakeholders are part of the governance of the company. That enables us to design the company so that it's not just there to multiply financial capital, taking in people and natural resources and creating products and waste, but rather it's all of the capitals are part of the growth engine. So every capital that the company touches will grow rather than just being treated as a resource or a waste product. That leads on to, within each company, there being a fair balancing of value contribution and return versus needs, especially relevant for the staff. The final thing we need to take into account in incorporation is incorporate in a way that allows companies to connect with each other. And if you think of the standard forms of companies today, whether it's a limited company, GmbH, or it's a cooperative, a Genossenschaft, or anything like that, they're not really designed to connect with each other than in a very hands-off fashion through simple transactional contracts. They're not designed to collaborate, to really work with each other the way that different species in nature both collaborate and compete. And what we've developed to enable that to work is something that we call the Fair Shares Commons. The Fair Shares Commons has these following characteristics. First of all, it's a commons. That is not only no ownership, and some of you may know some of the other approaches, like from the Purpose Foundation in Berlin, around steward-owned companies. The essence of the Fair Shares Commons goes even a step beyond that, in that it really looks at the company as a commons of productive capacity, something that is inherently not ownable, and beyond not ownable, inherently free, in the same way that if you look at the highly functioning commons that you find around the world, none of the people who are currently involved in that commons treat it in any way as anything like property. They treat it more as something that they have the privilege of benefiting from and the obligation to take care of, more in the way that a parent with a child has the privilege of having a child in their life to raise and the obligation to raise the child well. So that's really the essence of the Fair Shares Commons. And what that means is that it's structured in a way that everybody has governance rights and everybody has stewardship obligations. Everybody has a share of the wealth generated in all of the capitals you touch, and everybody has stewardship obligations towards those capitals, really enabling the company to stand on its own feet as a fully fledged entity in the ecosystem, and to interact with all of the other companies in a way that makes the ecosystem as a whole fundamentally regenerative and healthy. This, by the way, addresses one of the key Achilles heels of the circular economy, which is how do companies actually in a circle have trust towards each other over a decade, 2 decades, 5 decades long period, and how can they collaborate in such a way that they optimize the entire circle, not just each company in isolation. I'm not going to spend any time on the details of how it works. I can come back to this if people want to know more details. I'll move on now briefly into the adaptive way, the second of the 3 pillars. This is about how do we increase the interactivity within ourselves and between ourselves. By doing that, it eliminates many of the causes of startup failure. And I'll go for the moment into a story. One of the first companies we started working with 7 or 8 years ago now, the CEO brought us in saying to us, things are not working. Please do your diagnostic on the company and tell me who to fire. That was the mandate from the CEO to us. We did our diagnostic. The CEO read through the report, looked at the report in detail, looked at the report again in detail, and said, I think it's clear to me. I need to fire myself. I'm the problem. And within 6 weeks, the CEO had resigned from the company. The COO she'd stepped into the CEO role, and the company really started taking off. And the investor behind the company said that that was the smoothest CEO handover that he'd ever seen. And a while later, that the staff in the company, this was the best he'd ever seen in any of his companies in terms of staff actually working with each other for the good of the company, each person really understanding the strategy and understanding their role in the company. At the heart of that process that we used there is this approach that we have to what makes each of us what we are. A mixture of our hardwired nature, something that we can't change but we just need to accept. How we think and what we think. This combination of all 3 of these gives us the way that we behave, when we're optimistic, energized, the way we behave when we're stressed. And this shows up then in this diagram. What you're seeing here, on the left over here, that's the diagram you've just looked at in more detail. This combination of our nature, how we think and what we think, defines what we aspire to, what we try to achieve, what we hope for, our ambitions, and it defines the vulnerabilities that we need to protect. And the competition between these two, our aspirations and the vulnerabilities that we're protecting, these are in a tug of war with each other, leading to the actual behavior that we display. Whichever one of these wins in a certain situation leads to the behavior. This is at the heart of what I was saying earlier. Increasing the connectivity within myself is about really understanding what is it inside me that is driving both my aspirations and the behaviors that are contributing to me achieving my goals, and what is it that is contributing to what I might label bad habits or blocking behaviors or things that I dislike about myself that I want to change. By increasing connectivity within myself, I more and more get to recognize how those behaviors are actually trying to protect me from something that I believe I'm vulnerable towards. And the more I can bring my aspirations and my vulnerability parts of myself into interaction with each other, the more I can do two things. The more that I can, up here, come up with really innovative behaviors that simultaneously achieve my commitments and protect my vulnerabilities without getting stuck in either or behavior. And even better, the more I'm able to run experiential experiments that slowly transform how I interpret what's happening, the meaning I'm making of things, to learn new ways of thinking as well, and become more subtle in dealing with my hardwired nature. Now, this is something that is enormously powerful in the work context. Some superb research a couple of decades ago looked at what kinds of activities are people doing at work. And there's a whole block of activities that you could call job one. Job one is everything that somebody does because it's part of their job description. It's what they were hired to do, and it's productive, delivers results for the company. And there's a whole set of other job activities that people are doing, what's called job two. And job two is everything else that somebody needs to do at work to protect themselves from their colleagues and managers, to look good in the company, to position themselves for promotion. All of this job two activity is of limited or no benefit to the company's results and performance. And the really sad outcome of that research is that in very many companies, big and small, a significant number of people are putting well over half of their time and effort into job two, meaning that they have less than half of their time and effort working towards the health of the company, working towards results. So if we can find ways, like implementing the adaptive way, of reducing job two to only 10% and having the amount of effort, interactivity, action going into the healthy part of the company, we have a huge amount of capacity to really create healthy, vibrant, regenerative businesses without any extra effort, without any extra cost or investment. So moving forwards, and we're getting close to where I will come to an end. Another part of it, which I won't spend any time on, is having a fluid organization design where roles and tasks are done in a way that is based on everything that we've been talking about, in particular consent rather than dictatorship or consensus is at the heart of getting work done. And two really good examples of that are sociocracy and holacracy, both of which we work with. Deep inside this is also recognizing the vulnerabilities that each of us comes with when we join a company, and the roles of how do we use power and belonging in a healthy way. Too much emphasis on belonging and nothing gets done. Too much emphasis on power and things get done according to management by Hippo. It's the balance between them that we need in a fluid organization. So, if we want to get all of this, maximum interactivity, this is how we look at it. We've got three ways or three legs of an organization. We've got the horizontal leg of how the organization's systems and interactions work with real live human beings. We've got on the diagonal axis how the organization's systems and interactions are set up around roles and tasks. And on the vertical axis, we've got how the company is incorporated. In other words, how are the systems and interactions structured between stakeholders and the capitals? And what we're saying is to begin addressing the core causes of startup failure, of any company failure, we need to be at least at level 3 in each of these dimensions. And ideally, we need to get to level 5 in each of these dimensions. And the biggest reason, as far as we're concerned, that we're having so much trouble over the past decades really using business as a force for good to address our climate catastrophe lies in the fact that so many companies are at level 0 or level 1 in these three axes. And if you're at level 0 or level 1, the amount of interactivity is very low. The quality of the interactivity is extremely low. So, all of that is described in much more detail in the book. And now I'm going to come back to where I started. You remember this graph? This really summarizes in one very, very simple picture how most businesses behave today. And it doesn't matter whether these are startups in a venture capitalist portfolio or huge multinationals. Most companies do not survive for very long. The bigger companies, we need to think perhaps more in terms of decades rather than in months or a few years. But if you think back, Nokia in the early 2000s was one of the world's largest companies and seemed completely unassailable. And yet a few years after they were at their peak, they were on the edge of bankruptcy. So what is it that we ought to understand more deeply inside this in order for us to get to this? And we're absolutely convinced that if we do everything that we're describing, we can have companies that behave like this rather than like this. Well, in addition to everything that I've said, there's one final important message that I want to leave you with. Everything that we're taught in business school or in economics courses about how to plan for the future in an uncertain world is seriously flawed. So what's inside these simulations is a very typical business situation. Every cycle, here we have 100 businesses, each of them starting with 1,000 euros in their bank account over 365 business cycles. If it's a fast-moving company, each business cycle might be once a day. Other companies, that might be 10 years that is spanned in here. And what we're looking at in each cycle is there's a 50-50 chance of the business each cycle in their attempt to sell something, either winning the deal or losing the deal. And it's set up so that it's exactly 50-50. If the company wins the sale, their bank balance grows by 50%. If it loses the sale, their bank balance shrinks by 40%. Now, this represents in many ways a typical sales process. If you start to try to sell something at all, you start to incur cost of sale, outgoing expenses, which is what this represents. And you only get those monies back with some profit margin if you actually close the deal. So this is fairly typical for business. If you don't close the deal, you lose money. If you do close the deal, you gain more than you've lost. Now, in this particular graph, all of the factors are outside the business people's control. This is purely random. So the question is, what do you do? Do you attempt the deal or do you walk away? And if you attempt the deal and you lose, should you repeat it? The standard statistics taught in business schools, in economics, say that in this situation, you've got the probability you ought to grow on average 5% every deal. So whether you win or lose, what we're taught is to keep trying, because on average you've got a 5% growth rate. That is what's in this graph. This dotted line is that 5% growth rate. And yes, the average performance of these 100 companies tracks that dotted line quite closely initially and then starts to drop away. Unfortunately, what is being taught is simplistic statistics that does not apply to real business processes. In reality, if you look carefully at the business processes, you would get this dash dotted line. Accurate statistics says that each of these businesses is going to, on average, lose by 5% every time it attempts to close a sale on this basis. So this is something where if anybody who has set up their business on this basis is guaranteed to lose money, is guaranteed to collapse. And the companies that do succeed up to here are simply the companies that got lucky. If you get lucky for long enough and you get big enough, you become more resilient to misfortune. You have more chance of cornering the market, charging higher margins, etc., to compensate for this. There are two things you can do to deal with this situation. One of them is, just to go back to here, one of them is, instead of, if you close the deal, growing by 50%, if you increase your profit margin so that every time you close the deal, you grow by 83%, then you hit break even. So think about that for a moment. This is one of the reasons why businesses need to get so quickly to such high profit margins. It's because we're not looking properly at how business systems and interactions really work. And because we're confused and misunderstanding how they work, we're compensating by going to a much higher profit margin that we really need. And we're accepting a much higher failure rate in the early days of the startup than is actually necessary. We have so many companies that are failing despite having a really good team, a really good product market fit, and a fundamentally viable business. Now, if I go now to this simulation, same 100 companies, everything is the same in this one and this one, apart from one small change. In this case, after every cycle, the companies that successfully closed the deal put 1% of their growth, of the growth of their bank balance, into a shared pot, and that shared pot is divided equally across all 100 companies. Meaning that on average, the companies that were unlucky and lost the sale on that cycle get 0.5% of the growth from the lucky companies that closed the sale on that cycle. Just that very small level of connectivity, of interactivity between the companies at a systemic level, company to company, like nature in an ecosystem, completely transforms the dynamic from one where 92 of the 100 companies is bankrupt at the end of the year to one where every single company is still alive at the end of the year. The average is between 10 and 100 times higher, and the middle company is tens of thousands of times higher than it was down here. So that's really the evidence for what I'm saying, that if we truly want to build companies to thrive, if we truly want to make sure that these thriving companies can contribute the maximum to addressing our climate catastrophe and all of the other challenges we face, we need to build whole companies that are strongly connected to each other in all ways, within each person, between us as people, how we structure the roles, tasks, and match people to work, and in ways that include all of the stakeholders, all of the capitals, and in ways where the companies themselves can really connect with each other as a larger system of companies where they truly interact with each other. What we're seeing, if we do that, then at least 2, maybe even up to 8 or more in 12 companies can deliver real capital growth. And that means we've got so much more money available to put into regenerating the climate, nature, society. We're not wasting what we're currently wasting. And then because all of these different capitals and their stakeholders are included in the governance, we naturally have ESG, we naturally have impact, we naturally have the triple bottom line in the DNA at no extra cost and no extra effort. We're buffered against unpredictable change. We're strengthened, not weakened, by conflict in the management team and everywhere else. It becomes a highly adaptive, vibrant system because of high interactivity. So that's at the heart of everything we believe, everything we're doing. That's how you can find us. And I will now say thank you everybody for paying attention for so long. And the stage is now open for any questions, discussions, whatever anybody wants to throw into the mix.
No, just giving applause. Thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Only a pleasure. Thank you for investing 90 minutes of your life into it. Hopefully that is an investment that will pay off.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great inspiration. Definitely, I just quit a cooperative. So we were working in that holacracy model and cooperative. And actually, I'm just on a sabbatical, so I might return to them. But I experienced a great learnings experience, and also things that you shared, that we had a more resilient system and there were more people backing up the whole thing. But we were partly extremely slow in decision making. And it was also a setup where people were not really into all these holacracy processes. So, so my question would be to you: do you see any success factors for these new types of organizational collaboration and cooperatives and holacracy systems that prevent people feel frustrated, since decision making needs more time and time is money, etc.? You know what I mean? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely perfect question. You know, what's behind that is, let me just go down to the corner again. So if I come back up to here, what we found, and I started using holacracy in 2008. Brian Robertson was involved in one of the endeavors I was working in, and he helped us bring holacracy into what we were doing. And so I really recognize with what you're saying. The two challenges that we found, which is why we have this triple-legged operating system now. The one challenge is that each of us was coming in with our own internal tensions as a human being, and this was leading to tensions between us as human beings. And these tensions, what we found, are actually often the more critical tensions that need to be resolved. So one of the things that leads to slow decision making in holacracy is when holacracy is being used either as a way of job two. People are using holacracy to protect their own vulnerabilities. And that means that people are not coming into a holacratic integrative decision process in an open, exploring, confident way that if we say, yes, it's good enough for now and safe enough to try, we actually move forwards with the decision. But rather people are still out of a place of internal vulnerability, fearful. And so it's still too much in a consensus decision making rather than an integrative consent decision making. That's one of the causes, which is why what we do in our internal sequencing is that whenever a tension comes in, we split the tension first of all into what part of this tension is human. It's either inside me or between Marie and myself as two people in the leadership team or in the anchor circle from a holacratic perspective. And what part of the tension is purely in the roles that each of us is energizing. And then what we do is we first look at the human tension, because our argument is if there is some tension inside me or between us as human beings, this is going to load us up emotionally. We're not going to have the same meaning-making, emotional bandwidth, etc., to really try to work on what's happening in the roles and tasks. Now, working on the human dimension might mean something as simple as saying, okay, I recognize this human tension. Are we okay if we have a one-on-one conversation between each other using the adaptive way in 3 hours' time after the meeting? And most of the time it's, oh, okay, I get that. Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. Or we say, okay, we can process this quite quickly. This is known big assumptions, da-da-da-da-da. Okay, we've put the human animals to sleep enough that we can dive into a holacratic process. That's the first one. The second big one comes then into incorporation. In whether it's a non-profit or a for-profit, if it's incorporated in a traditional way, there are a few individuals who have the legal power. It might be the venture capital firm that has the legal power over the company and can decide what to do or what not to do. Like a friend of mine was part of a holacratic consultancy about 6 to 7 years ago now. And he arrived at work one Monday morning to discover that the founder of the company, who owned all of the shares, had sold the company on the previous Friday to a private equity firm. And he arrived at work on Monday morning to discover a completely new management team in place. And the first thing that they did was rip out holacracy and put in a standard management hierarchy. And again, I've so often seen that in the companies that we've worked with, that if you have an ownership structure that concentrates power in the hands of a couple of people, that gives you some kind of a background force field, a gravitational force field of a power hierarchy. And again, that leads to, in an implicit way, management by hippo, rather than really bringing holacracy to full power. So those are the two of the thoughts, Matthias, that I've experienced that link to your question. The flip side is I've experienced sociocracy and holacracy leading to incredibly fast, effective decision making once everybody has truly grasped how to process internal tensions, tensions between each other, and the role-task tensions, and if there is a level of psychological safety because nobody in the incorporation has dictatorial power over the company.
Thanks a lot. And maybe to add, what we learned is that holacracy works with paid employees, so that can really dedicate their time into the processes. And in our situation, we had like freelancers that spent unpaid time into holacracy processes, and then there was less willingness to spend the time. So that was also something we learned, that it's working better if the people are really paid during that work.
Yes, I can actually echo that, and I'd add to that I find holacracy has quite a large overhead. The minimum amount of understanding, time and effort you need to put in just to drive the system is quite large. And so if you're working with people who are not full-time employees, and in particular who are not paid, holacracy can very easily turn into something where too much of the time and effort is going into keeping the holacratic engine moving and not enough into actually productive work. And so my recommendation to people is to do something that is powerful enough for what needs to be done by that team at the moment, and as light as possible. And I find in many cases the flexibility of sociocracy to tune it to suit yourself is often more effective in organizations than a full holacratic implementation. Yeah, and the two of them are very close. And Brian Robertson developed holacracy after he was trained in sociocracy, and he fixed many of the variables in sociocracy into presets in holacracy.
Hey, Graham, thank you so much for this amazing presentation and talk. And we're so happy to have you here today for the meetup. And my question to you would be, how do you envision the path from today's model at scale to this model, to the more fluid system at scale? What does it take? What are the premises to make that transition, to accelerate that transition, which we all know we need so much?
Yes, that's a really good question. In one sense, I think that the path, and the reason why we're doing what we're doing is because we think that this is the path, is to really begin with startups before the team is even formed around the business concept. That if we start up in this new way from day one, that everybody in the startup is well experienced and fluid in this way of working, what I describe in my book, then we're in the best position to really do it well, to grow the company fast, to grow entire regenerative, net positive, circular economy ecosystems fast with the minimum wastage. Anything else is going to have more wastage. Up until 5 years ago, I thought that we could do everything by working with existing companies and transforming them. And what I've realized in many, many attempts to work with existing companies and transform them is that the causes of failure are very, very resistant to change. In particular, elements of how people interact with each other, how each of us shows up at work, it's hard to change that, and even harder to change how the investors see the company, see each other and interact with the company. That one is almost impossible to change once the company has already been incorporated. Not impossible, it can be done, but it's really tough. So for the past 5 years, we've moved ever deeper into our startup factory approach of let's build an example that really works so much better than anything else that in a few years' time, existing businesses will start to look at it and say, oh wow, we want some of that for ourselves. And then it becomes easy to transform existing businesses. At the moment, we don't have a large enough ecosystem of companies that work in this full way, and in particular companies where the level of interactivity between the companies can give us this kind of synergy between the companies, what's in this graph. Once we have a big enough ecosystem to prove how this works, then companies are going to flock into this way of working because it will be patently visible that it works so much better.
Thank you, Graham. And maybe a follow-up question to this, since we have the Factory Berlin, we have the Sustainability Circle hosting this, and also thanks to Greg for moderating today. The guests we have today, there might be a couple of startups in there. If they're interested to becoming part of Evolute 6 and the movement, they just write to you. They just go to your website.
Yeah.
How can they find you?
If they head to our website, and I will go down to where that is now, just head to our website. There we are. You can contact us through the website, and you have our LinkedIn addresses there. My Twitter address is also there. So you can reach us via the website, and also you can, email is not the best way of reaching out to me, but you can reach out to Marie as well. Marie's a bit better on email than I am. Can I give your email address, Marie?
I gave it in the chat.
Perfect. So Marie's email address is in the chat. It's also marie@evolute6.com. So you can reach out to us there. And the other thing I'll put in is we run a book webinar once a month on the last Tuesday of every month. And there we go through in more detail various of the topics we've touched on here. The next book webinar is tomorrow evening, where we'll be talking about how to build a regenerative economy. And my co-author Jack Reardon is going to be speaking about that. And the registration details for the webinar are, on my personal website, graham-boyd.biz, on the web page within that for the book Rebuild. So if you want to know more, you can dive into that. And that also, if you on that page look at the videos 2/3 of the way down, those are on our YouTube channel, And we have recordings of all of the webinars over the past 12 months on the YouTube channel, so you can catch up on everything that we've been talking about in detail about the various aspects of what I've been saying via the YouTube channel.